In the early part of the 19th century, England was experiencing an economic boom of unprecedented growth. English advancements in the mechanization of industry put them at the forefront of what came to be known as the Industrial Revolution. Fueled by the perfection of the steam engine, everything from manufacturing to transportation on both land and sea became totally redefined. Yet this revolution also brings with it a darker side, one that emphasizes progress at any cost, exacting from some the ultimate price. At 11 p.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, an armistice is signed between the Germans and the Allied forces, bringing the previous 4 years of conflict known as World War I to an end. Across the globe, the end of the war is greeted with celebration and an overwhelming sense of relief. With the Great War behind them, America looks to the future with a renewed sense of optimism. Nowhere more so than the city of Boston, Massachusetts, who already have a reason to celebrate.
Boston 1919 was a city in jubilation, actually. The war was over, and the Red Sox had won the World Series in 1918. People were actually looking forward to the next coming baseball season. It was a time when the city was feeling pretty good about itself.
In the city's working-class North End, people occupy themselves with the welcome task of retooling Boston's factories from wartime to peacetime efforts.
It was an Irish neighborhood in great measure. There was also a sizable Jewish population. And then at the very end of the 19th century, and just before World War I, around that time, it became an Italian neighborhood.
Very close-knit kind of neighborhood. The neighbors knew each other, they cared about each other. And they were, for the most part, people of humble origins.
One of the factories in the neighborhood is the Purity Distilling Company, owners of a large holding tank that dominates the North Boston skyline.
Now, the tank itself was a steel storage tank, approximately 50 feet high and approximately 90 feet in diameter. So it contained a large quantity, more than 2 million American gallons of molasses.
It was a tank that was constructed by the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Its subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, actually owned the tank. And the purpose of the tank was to house molasses. Its principal purpose was the distillation into alcohol for the production of munitions during the war.
The structure of tanks at that time, because they didn't have the technology that we have today of welding, were made with steel plates. What they would do is punch holes in the edges of the steel plates and rivet one steel plate to the other. They could do a lap joint, for example, where one plate, the end of one plate went over the other and a series of holes and rivets through it. Or they could do a butt joint with backup plates on either side. And both of these methods of connecting were used in the tank.
Molasses pumped into the tank from freight ships in the harbor was then placed in rail cars and shipped to a nearby distillery. But with the war over, the sudden drop in demand for alcohol results in a surplus of molasses. Yet as the tank stands its quiet vigil over the historic Boston Harbor, it silently prepares to make history itself.
In early January of 1919, a small tanker vessel arrived from Matanzas, Cuba. Her name was the Mio Lauro. And the Mio Lauro offloaded molasses into the tank.
Molasses was pumped from the ship through a pipeline, and the pipeline came up through the bottom of the tank, so that therefore there was no hauling of molasses back and forth.
600,000 gallons are added to the tank, bringing the level of molasses to within inches of the tank's brim.
It was built to hold 2.3 million gallons. And the last shipment came, which brought the total amount of molasses in the tank to 2,319,525.
Yet no one seems to give the nearly 20,000 gallons of excess molasses any thought. Indeed, as the days progress, Bostonians' thoughts turn to the weather.
This particular January, we had here in Boston something that we have often, a January thaw. And in mid-January, the temperature climbed up to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit.
People go about their daily tasks, taking whatever opportunity they can to enjoy the unseasonably warm weather. Among them, Elizabeth O'Brien, who plants a row of geraniums on her windowsill. Likewise, Bridget Cloherty, a widow with 3 children, finds an opportunity to take her work outside.
She was outside hanging up her laundry. 2 of her kids, Teresa and Stephen, were downstairs. And her older son, Martin, who was a well-known middleweight boxer and referee in Boston, he was asleep on the 3rd floor of the house.
Others find themselves captives of their occupations, whiling the day away indoors.
Engine House 31 was a fireboat, and it was right in back of the tank, and there were 4 firemen. There were Pete Driscoll, George Leahy, Nat Bowering, and William Connor, and they were all playing cards on the 1st floor.
Patrolman Frank McManus walks his usual beat near the harbor on his way to a call box to check in with the station house. By lunchtime, many file out into the warm air to enjoy the all-too-brief respite from winter and work. Among them, a handful of public works employees who assemble at a nearby park to spend their lunch break in the sun. School children, such as Anthony DeStasio and his sister Mary, make their way home for lunch, picking up scraps of firewood along the way. All are oblivious to the common bond that they share, one that will change their lives forever. That they are all within 500 feet of the silent tank and its slowly swelling contents.
Now, in the wintertime, when it's generally cold here in New England, the molasses tank's vents were sealed up. They were opened in the warm spring and summer, but in the wintertime they were sealed. The molasses in the tank actually expanded.
At 12:30 p.m. that day, a strange sound echoes across the streets of North Boston.
People heard the sound of what they thought was almost like a machine gun, a rapid series of small explosions. And the next thing they knew, that the tank that was there in Commercial Street seemed to explode.
As Patrolman McManus calls into the station, his voice is slowly drowned out.
Police officer Frank McManus, he did his routine patrol around Commercial Street, and he had just passed the tank. And as he passed it, he heard a strange noise and felt something wet and sticky. He thought it was mud or something hit him on the back. And then he turned around just in time to see the molasses tank kind of plunge out and the molasses coming towards him.
Before eyewitnesses can comprehend what is unfolding before them, the Cloherty house is wiped out in the massive wave of molasses, which hits the house at a rate of 35 miles an hour. Sergeant McManus finds the swelling wave upon him almost immediately, scrambling to make it to another call box to notify headquarters.
The next second, a wave of molasses swept up the street in my direction, but I beat it out in the race, where I rushed up a side street and escaped.
At the fire hall, William Connor can't quite comprehend what he sees rushing towards him.
I sat facing the window, and as I glanced up, I saw a great wall of molasses. It seemed 250 feet high. It came with the speed of a cyclone.
Instinctively, Pete Driscoll dives for an open window on the north side of the building as the molasses strikes the firehouse with the force of 2 tons per square foot. Anthony and Mary DeStasio instinctively scatter in a vain effort to dodge the rushing wave. Anthony finds himself violently hurled to the ground.
And he was trying to run away from it. And he describes in the papers that he was knocked down like he was tackled by a football player. And he hit the curb and knocked out 2 of his front teeth.
Miraculously, Anthony manages to grab a hold of a nearby lamppost. From the vantage point of her 3rd-story apartment, Anthony's mother Carmela watches speechlessly as the disaster unfolds, unable to recognize the child clinging to the lamppost as her own son.
You could see his mom, but he couldn't speak because his mouth was so full of molasses. So he had to try to pull it out of his mouth so he could breathe, but he still couldn't get the words out. He eventually passed out or just collapsed out of exhaustion.
Martin Cloherty awakens, finding himself floating amidst the wreckage of his home.
In less time than it takes to tell it, I woke to find myself in the ruins and heavy weights pressing in my chest. A pile of wreckage was holding me down.
All of a sudden he heard a noise and he woke up and got the sensation that he was floating. And he thought that he was overboard, like he had gone and fallen into the harbor. But when he woke up a little bit more, he realized, well, I'm floating in this molasses stuff. And then he had realized that his house was basically gone.
Martin immediately seeks out the rest of his family, managing to locate his stunned siblings and scoop them into a makeshift raft. Pete Driscoll escapes and is shielded from the torrent of molasses by the structure of the fire hall, despite the fact that it has been swept off its footings and pushed almost into the harbor.
What happened with a lot of these wooden structures was that the first floor was taken out. So they were on the first floor, the floor was taken out, and the second floor collapsed onto the first. And they were trapped in about an 18-inch space because when the second story fell, it fell on top of a pool table, a piano, some chairs. So they had like 18 inches and they were all trapped under debris.
Inside, Connor, Bowering, and Leahy find themselves with mere inches of breathing room as the level of molasses continues to swell. The noise of the exploding tank draws the attention of the residents of North Boston, including Ignatius Stagno.
I was busy picking up wood for my family. I heard about the thing happening. I thought I'd take a look. Being inquisitive, young people never really stop thinking, you know.
Fallout from the tank hits the elevated structure, weakening the supports and ripping a gash in the tracks.
And there could have been a tremendous disaster there because it weakened the supports just as a subway car was coming around the corner, of course loaded with passengers. The motorman saw what was happening and brought the train to a halt.
Panicked at the scene before him, Ignatius Stagno beats a hasty retreat.
I couldn't get near there. I couldn't do much. I didn't dare. I had to mind my own business, so to speak.
On the street below, the wave of molasses washes out to sea, allowing the rescue effort to begin.
You had people now caught in molasses. They couldn't move, and gradually they were submerged and drowned. The molasses, this thick, sticky substance, went into people's mouths, noses, ears, and they couldn't breathe.
News of the disaster quickly spreads, sending relief workers from around the city swarming into the North Boston area. Among them, Officer Frank McManus and the Red Cross Motor Corps.
This was one of the first missions that these Red Cross girls were sent out to do, and they came up and they had their nice white suits and their nice white shoes and hats, and reports say that they just jumped right in, and by the time they got out they were just covered in molasses.
Rescuers find their efforts hampered by the strange circumstances of the disaster, specifically the gooey muck of molasses.
And they could see forms that were struggling in the molasses, but you couldn't tell if it was a human or an animal because they were just, just covered in molasses. And it seemed like the more people struggled, the more they get stuck, kind of like a fly on flypaper.
The wounded are quickly rushed to the nearby Haymarket Relief Station.
At the Haymarket Relief Station was just a bizarre scene. The only way they could get the molasses off of these people was with warm water.
Driscoll and Bowering shout instructions to the rescue crews trying to liberate them from the wreckage of the fire hall. When the flood blows out the main floor of her apartment building, Elizabeth O'Brien finds herself alongside neighbor Catherine Keenan, who searches frantically for the box containing her life savings. Despite the unstable conditions of the building, Patrolman William F. McDonald ventures back into the wreckage. Finally, rescue crews at the fire station manage to break through, but for 37-year-old engineer George Leahy, not soon enough.
George Leahy, he was trapped under a pool table, and he was really struggling to try to keep his head above the molasses. According to newspaper reports, George Leahy's last words were, "Oh my God, Bill, I'm lost. I'm gone." And he slipped underneath the molasses. He just couldn't physically stay above it anymore.
The adrenaline of the rescue teams numbs them to the horrors before them as they search for survivors. The public works employees at the park are killed instantly by the sheer force of the molasses surge. Other bodies are recovered, their condition evidence of the horrific final moments of their lives. After an hour of frantic searching, Martin Clordy finally finds his mother.
And they found out a couple hours later that she didn't survive the initial wave and was crushed. What actually happened to the house is the wave hit the house, lifted up the house foundation, and crashed it against the elevated structure. So if you see pictures of the house before and after, the house is completely gone.
Out of all the destruction caused by the molasses flood, Patrolman McDonald manages to salvage one thing from the wreckage.
He took the time to go back and he saved about 3,180 banknotes from the house, which was going above and beyond the call of what he had to do.
But an even more amazing salvation is taking place in a makeshift morgue down the street, where Anthony DeStasio's sister tries to determine her younger brother's fate.
They knew that Tony and both Maria were missing. Well, he ended up waking up and he had this white sheet over him, and he woke up and he got the stitches and he was okay.
As the sun sets on January 15th, 21 are confirmed dead and over 100 more injured. Those missing are presumed dead as Boston tries to recompose itself. residents of North Boston begin as best they can to return to their daily lives. Yet the evidence of January 15th is slow to be removed from the stricken area.
For days afterwards, you know, you'd go into the subway and sit down, and you'd sit down in a little kind of puddle of molasses, and everything around was sticky. You pick up a telephone in Worcester, and you could get molasses on your hands. The stickiness traveled everywhere.
In the days that follow, the cleanup yields constant reminders of the horror of that fateful January day.
Maria ended up being killed. She was flattened, crushed by a freight car. She was found a couple days later.
Little Antonio D'Estasio describes being picked up by the police and tossed into the back of a cart with 3 dead bodies, which must have been a pretty shocking moment in the life of an 11-year-old boy.
Then, of course, he had the added sadness that his sister, you know, just the fact that if he would have ran with his sister, or if he would have got his sister to run with him, the outcome could have been a lot different.
As the residents of North Boston begin to put their lives back together, people begin searching for answers as to the cause of the disaster.
In the aftermath of the collapse of the tank, there was a lot of recrimination and a lot of finger-pointing. The Purity Distilling Company accused saboteurs, German saboteurs, an external explosion.
And this was something that U.S. Industrial and Purity Distilling really tried to push. Their attorney, Henry Dolan, thought that if you could say it was an outside explosion, it wouldn't be their fault, therefore they wouldn't be liable.
But the real explanation, while less conspiratorial, proves to be equally reckless.
The city person that approved the building of this thing looked at the drawings, didn't do any analysis on the thing. He assumed because an engineer had brought it in that the thing had been carefully designed. The engineer that brought it in worked for the Purity Distilling Company and was only concerned with the concrete foundation on which it was sitting. He'd done nothing in terms of checking out whether the design of the tank itself was okay.
The official report, filed by engineer Harry M. Stewart of the Boston Elevated Company, concludes that the half-inch tank plates in the lower and second courses were too weak to contain the volume of molasses it was holding.
In terms of the hoop stress, or the stress around the tank due to the pressure inside, it was, by modern-day standards, way below standards, and even by the standards at the day, or of that day, it was considered to be very low.
The release of Stewart's report paves the way for civil court actions to be brought against the U.S. Industrial Alcohol Company.
There were 119 lawsuits filed against Purity Distilling and U.S. Industrial, which was its parent company. U.S. Industrial was eventually found at fault, and they had to pay out over $1 million in damages. And the average was $6,000 per family for people who were killed.
As a result of Stewart's findings, more stringent guidelines are put into effect for the building and inspection of holding tanks.
One of the fundamental changes that happened is that the loopholes that had existed before that allowed a structure called a receptacle to have less inspection than might otherwise be necessary, those loopholes were closed. And henceforward, and to this very day, of course, receptacles for gasoline, for petroleum products, for natural gas, for any large organic raw material like that, those receptacles are carefully scrutinized, carefully monitored.
It definitely changed the city of Boston's guidelines in terms of how they were going to accept things. The story probably went all over North America at the time, and every city across the country probably started to look at the drawings that came into them more carefully, make sure that they had in fact been carefully analyzed.
All that stands as a reminder of the molasses flood of 1919 is a small plaque near the harbor front and the ghost of memories that live on today.
I think it was a tremendous tragedy at the time, and with distance, people are almost incredulous. that it ever happened. It seems such a remarkably bizarre event.
In events and tragedies in history, it's not conspiracy that caused it. It's stupidity and callousness. And this is a classic example of that. It was the stupidity and the callousness of the city inspectors, of the people who filled that tank, of the distilling company that did not monitor the tank. Stupidity and callousness caused those deaths and those injuries, not conspiracy.
Yet 9 years earlier, human error was the cause of another catastrophe on the shores of the St. Lawrence River, approximately 400 miles to the north. By the mid-19th century, the boom brought on by the Industrial Revolution was beginning to be felt in eastern Canada, primarily the industry-based provinces of Ontario and Quebec.
At that time, the trade between the province of Quebec and, for that matter, the city of Quebec and the northeastern states, Maine, Vermont, New York, was flourishing. And there was a need for quick transportation of goods and services to the States and back.
The first international rail line between Maine and the province of Quebec was established in 1852. Running from Portland to Montreal, the twin rails became pipelines of economic prosperity flowing between the two countries. Yet, ironically, the province's capital, Quebec City, found itself cut off from railway opportunities by the geographical barrier of the St. Lawrence River.
Dans un premier temps, seulement qu'à Lévis, les trains arrivaient, les grands troncs. Fait qu'on a pu,
At first, the big trains used the boats to cross the river. And then the decision to build the Quebec Bridge was to unify both shores together.
unir les deux rives ensemble.
In 1897, the newly formed Quebec Bridge and Railway Company begins soliciting preliminary design plans from various bridge-building firms. The consultant on the project is American engineering legend Theodore Cooper, who in his late 60s sits at the end of a brilliant career in bridge building throughout the United States. Of all the plans submitted, Cooper recommends the cantilever design of the Phoenix Bridge Company. To cut costs, Cooper revises the original design by moving the support piers closer to shore, making them less expensive than piers built in deeper water, and shaving an entire year off construction. Yet many speculate that the revision is motivated by something more than simple economics. Cooper's design will make the Quebec Bridge the largest cantilever bridge in the world and will stand as the crowning achievement in Cooper's long and distinguished career. Yet within the design of an ambitious engineer's dream lays the culmination of engineering's worst nightmare. If anything could eclipse the arrival of the 20th century in Quebec, it is the sense of pride among its people, spawned from their involvement in creating the largest bridge the world has ever seen.
On dit que la plupart des ouvriers...
The majority of the workers wanted to work on the construction of one of the biggest bridges ever. There was feeling of pride.
And perhaps nowhere is the economic boom that the bridge brings with it more apparent than on the Caughnawaga Reserve.
The money was great compared to anywhere. Money was delicious, you know. That's the only way to say it, because when you got nothing, or you're working for $1 a day, when you're winding up, you're getting $10 a day. Hey, and that was a lot of money.
The men of the Caughnawaga Reserve enjoy the reputation as the world's best steelworkers. It is only natural that the vast majority of the men should come from the Caughnawaga Reserve. Construction begins in the spring of 1904 and proceeds without incident. By the summer of 1907, the bridge stands nearly half completed when the first warning signs begin to emerge.
What had happened was the dead load of the bridge was underestimated, and the stresses in the members would have been much above what was acceptable.
On August 6th, bending is detected in the bridge's lower support members during a routine inspection by Cooper's on-site consultant, Norman McClure. McClure quickly relays the news to Cooper, awaiting his advice. Cooper immediately contacts John Sterling Deans, head engineer of the Phoenix Bridge Company, demanding an explanation.
Ce dernier avait répondu, c'est pas surprenant puisque lorsque...
He responded that this wasn't surprising, as when the metal left Phoenixville, the beams were already crooked. As they were already crooked, it wasn't strange that the structure had crooked beams.
Cooper suggests that the members were bent by collision with other members during erection. Despite company assurances, workers on the bridge can't ignore what they can see with their own eyes. Then on August 28, 1907, evidence arises that McClure cannot ignore.
When I first measured the 9L chord of the anchor arm, it was only 3/4 of an inch out of line. Now it is 2 1/4 inches. Their present shape is undoubtedly due to the stress they are now receiving.
Among those convinced that the bridge is failing are D.B. Haley and his partner George Cook. Testing his own theory, Haley draws a chalk mark on the bent member at the end of work on the 28th.
I said I will put a mark on that, and if it is any worse tomorrow, I am gone from here.
McClure is dispatched to New York to persuade Cooper in person of the severity of the situation.
The resident engineer had stopped all construction and sent a telegram to Cooper that unless we hear from you, there will be no further construction on the bridge.
But incredibly, work is allowed to continue in McClure's absence, authorized by Edward A. Hoare, chief engineer of the Quebec Bridge Company. For the workers on the Quebec Bridge, August the 29th breaks with overwhelming anxiety. Some choose to turn a deaf ear to the rumors, such as Rivet Gang boss Alexandre Beauvais. Others, like Thomas Montour, are reluctant to work on the bridge at all, until he is persuaded otherwise by his older brother Angus. At their usual post at the end of the bridge, Haley and Cook await the arrival of the scuttle train known as the Traveler. The Traveler hauls steel from the fabrication yard at Chaudelet to the bridge. 60 feet above, Thomas Montour makes his way to his station at the highest point of the south span. Alexandre Beauvais and Angus Montour take their position behind the erector gangs, not far from the now infamous chords of 8 and 9L. In New York, Cooper arrives at his office to find McClure waiting for him.
Theodore Cooper realized the seriousness of the situation. After a few minutes of discussion, they sent a telegram.
The telegram is sent to John Deans at Phoenixville. Although he is aware that men are working on the bridge, he fails to forward the message to the bridge site, stubbornly clinging to his conviction that the members were bent when they left the fabrication yards. Apprehension on the bridge begins to dissolve at 5:30 when the whistle blows, signaling the men on the bridge to put their tools away for the day. But before the 5:45 whistle can blow to send them home, a different sound erupts from the bridge.
At 5:37 p.m., you could hear a loud, dreadful crash. Everyone thought it was an earthquake.
The bend in chord 9L finally gives way, sending the bridge and the men on it into the St. Lawrence River. Among them, Alexandre Beauvais stands right at the breaking point.
I was right inside the cord. As soon as I felt it break, I made a grab for the plate.
Angus Montour, however, finds himself on the other side of the gap, riding the descending bridge into the waters below. With no time to think, Thomas Montour jumps off the bridge, plummeting towards the river 300 feet below. D.B. Haley and George Cook find themselves in the water before they can even perceive what has happened.
The first thing I knew, I caught myself going through the air. I was in the water before the noise came.
Horrified witnesses rush to the site, while men trapped in the twisted steel plead vainly for help. At 5:37 p.m. on August 29, 1907, workers on the Quebec Bridge are hurled into the St. Lawrence amidst 30 million pounds of steel. Those near the shore who survived the fall are pinned under the massive bridge members.
D'autres sont demeurés pris dans l'acier. Et quand la catastrophe s'est
They tried to dislodge the men, but with little success. Many were dead or injured as tide was down and began to rise.
The water's coming in and men are asking to be killed before they drown to death. Yeah. Some maybe just clothes holding them, but the point is they can't get out. They're pinned.
Knocked unconscious on impact, Thomas Montour comes to and manages to drift a quarter-mile downriver before being rescued. The body of his brother Angus is never recovered, presumed trapped beneath the mass of steel. D.B. Haley is rescued by a passing boat, but his partner George Cook is not so lucky. Like so many others, his body is never recovered. News of the tragedy reaches the Kanawage Indian Reserve, where most of the bridge workers live.
In fact, among all the Indians who were at the bridge, most of them had been killed. There were 33 altogether, and I believe only 8 were buried in the local cemetery in Kanawaga. Many stayed on the site along with other laborers that were never found.
The final death toll is calculated at 76. A royal commission into the collapse places the blame at the feet of both the Quebec and Phoenixville Bridge Companies and Theodore Cooper.
Alors, il y a eu la commission royale dans...
There was a royal commission reported the 10th of March, 1910, and from that moment on, the Quebec Bridge and Railway Company was ruined.
As for Theodore Cooper, his career ends in close association with one of the most catastrophic bridge disasters in the world. Yet despite the tragic setback, the governments of Canada and Quebec forge ahead with plans for a new bridge. Over the next 2 years, remnants of the old bridge are removed from the St. Lawrence River. Construction on the second bridge begins in 1912. The bridge remains a cantilever structure with one distinguishing difference.
On avait construit les deux losanges de chaque côté.
They built 2 diamonds on each side, and all that was missing on the bridge was the center span, constructed in Chauvelet, 3.5 miles down the river.
By the summer of 1916, the 2 arms of the bridge are completed. All that remains is for the central span to be floated downriver and lifted into place with hydraulic jacks. Only the very best workers are chosen for this task. But due to the risk involved, the chosen workers demand and receive an astronomical $10 per hour for the day. This time, the men of the Kanawage Reserve have opted to stay home. But the ghosts of the first attempt at raising the Quebec Bridge still haunt the handful of men about to make the second. Among them is Alexandre Barbeau. Likewise, W.B. Fortune, head engineer of the St. Lawrence Bridge Company, insists on overseeing every aspect of the raising of the bridge to ensure that the fate of the second bridge won't mirror the first. September 11th, 1916. 9 years have passed since the failed first attempt. At 6:35 a.m., the central span arrives at the bridge. On shore, thousands have gathered to witness the spectacle.
With the aid of hydraulic pumps, they lifted the span 2 feet at a time.
By 9:30 a.m., a break is given to Alexandre Barbeau and his co-workers. At this point, the central span is suspended 20 feet above the water.
They started work again at 10:30. They had just completed another lift of 2 feet when it ended.
One of the jacks on the bridge failed, and as the jack failed, of course, the span fell into the river.
Il y avait des personnes qui étaient sur les cantilevers de chaque côté.
There were also people on the cantilevers on both sides that were shaken off, and that there were many people who were on the cantilevers that were thrown over the security rails and fell into the water.
Among those rescued from the river is Alexandre Barbeau.
Right when the span fell, he was on the central span filling his pipe. The people in his family still tell the story that Mr. Barbeau fell right to the bottom of the river and a few seconds later was rescued by a government boat. They say that when he was taken from the water, he still held in his hands his pipe and his pouch of tobacco.
Casualties in the second tragedy total 13. Yet again, in the face of tragedy, the quest to build the bridge continues.
There was never the option of not having a bridge. Despite this failure, I don't believe that people thought for a moment to not build the bridge.
The next day, the St. Lawrence Bridge Company publicly announces its plans to continue building the bridge. The company assumes full responsibility for the failure and compensates the families of the victims. A year later, the second attempt at raising the span is made, this time successfully. In the end, the world's largest cantilever bridge costs $25 million and claims 89 lives. Yet after over 80 years, the Quebec Bridge has been studied by engineers more than any other bridge in the world.
Amongst the things that we learned was that we have to be very careful about the design process. We must estimate all of the loads as accurately as is possible. So if we were to build a similar bridge today, I don't think we would have the same problem with the knowledge that we have now.
La leçon à tirer en premier, la plus importante leçon, c'est que
the biggest lesson, the most important lesson, is that you can never leave a project of such magnitude in the hands of one person. Even if they were incredibly confident in the abilities of Theodore Cooper, they shouldn't have put all the responsibility on the shoulders of one person.
But for the people of the Kahnawake Reserve, all of whom lost at least one relative in the disaster, the Quebec Bridge represents something more.
It didn't take long for the people says, well, if any Indians ever go back out, he says, well, they're not going in a big group like they did. So this won't happen again.
Within these two events lay disasters of man-made proportions unlike any the human race has ever seen before. And as the wheels of progress grind ceaselessly forward, we find they will not be the last. As technology grows, so too does our understanding of it and respect for it. And as humanity stands at the foot of yet another revolution, it will keep the teachings of these hard-learned lessons at the forefront of all its endeavors.